I have spent the last 4 years trying to make sense of what I found on that mountain, and I still can't do it in any way that satisfies me. I'm a search and rescue volunteer out of a small county in western North Carolina, have been for going on 18 years. In that time, I've worked over 200 operations, lost hikers, injured climbers, missing kids, a few suicides. You see things in this work that stay with you, and you develop a tolerance for it over time, a kind of professional distance that lets you function when things get bad. You learn to compartmentalize. You learn to finish the job and drive home and sit down to dinner and not carry every face with you into sleep. Most of the time that works. Most of the time the distance holds. What I'm about to describe broke through that distance in a way nothing else ever has, and I want to be clear from the start that I'm not telling this story because I want attention or because I'm looking for someone to believe me. I spent the first 2 years after this happened telling myself I didn't need anyone to believe me, that I knew what I had seen and documented, and that was enough. But Gerald Pryor went into those mountains and didn't come back the same, and the official explanation for what happened to him is not the truth. I knew that the moment I found him. I knew it even more clearly 3 days later when I went back to that ravine alone and spent 4 hours in the cold documenting what the official report had quietly chosen not to include. Gerald was 51 years old, retired electrician, divorced, lived alone in a modest house outside of Brevard on about 12 acres of wooded property that bordered the Pisgah National Forest on its southern edge. He was the kind of man who existed comfortably in those woods, the way some people exist comfortably in their own living rooms. He had been hiking solo in the Pisgah for the better part of 2 decades, knew the trail systems the way some people know the streets of their own neighborhood, knew which creek crossings ran high in spring and which ridgelines caught wind and which hollows held fog until nearly noon. He carried the right gear, layered properly for the season, filtered his water, filed his trip plans with his daughter every single time without exception. He never took unnecessary risks. He was not a reckless man. That matters, because the official version of what happened to Gerald relies heavily on the implication that he made poor decisions in unfamiliar terrain. Neither of those things was true. When his daughter reported him overdue on a Sunday evening in late October of 2019, nobody on our team panicked right away. Gerald was the kind of experienced solo hiker who sometimes stayed out an extra night if the weather suited him and the solitude felt worth it. His daughter knew this about him and still called it in on time because that was the agreement they had. But by Monday morning, with overnight temperatures having dropped into the upper 20s and no contact made by any means, we activated a full search. There were 12 of us on the initial deployment. We divided into 4 teams and started working outward from his trailhead parking location on a gravel service road off the main forest access near the Davidson River corridor, about 9 miles east of Brevard. His truck was there, a dark green Ford F-150 with high mileage and a faded parking permit on the dash. The handwritten note he'd left was in a plastic sleeve on the passenger seat, visible through the window. His intended route, estimated daily mileage, planned campsite location, and expected return time. Everything exactly as it should be. The kind of preparation that makes experienced volunteers take a breath before they start, because it means you are looking for someone who gave themselves every reasonable chance of being found. The weather that first day was gray and cold and pressing. Late October in the southern Appalachians has a particular quality that is hard to describe to someone who hasn't worked in it. The sky comes down low, and the color goes out of everything, and the smell of the air changes, becomes heavier, layered with wet leaves and cold soil and something almost like iron. The forest gets quiet in a way that is different from ordinary quiet, not peaceful, not still in the way a room is still. It is waiting quiet, the kind that sits in your chest if you pay attention to it, the kind that experienced people in those mountains have learned to read as a warning about weather or about something else they can't always name. I have felt that quiet hundreds of times in 18 years. I felt it that first morning before we were 2 miles into the search, and I noted it the way you note a temperature drop, filed it away, kept moving. I had covered close to 4 miles of trail by early afternoon, working the northeast sector with a partner named Davis who had been on the team almost as long as I had. The trail Gerald had been following in this section passed through a long stretch of dense rhododendron thicket, the kind that closes over the trail and turns the light green and makes sound travel strangely before opening onto a ridge with long views to the west and northwest. Just before that opening, where the thicket ended and the ridge began, there was a muddy drainage crossing. Water comes off the slope there year-round and keeps the ground soft even in dry seasons. It was the kind of spot that holds prints well, and I'd been checking those spots methodically all morning. I found a single boot impression that matched the tread pattern we had been briefed on at staging. Gerald's boot, no question about the pattern, but something about the print stopped me the moment I saw it. The impression was deep, driven into the mud with significantly more force than a man of Gerald's build walking at a normal pace should have produced. I crouched over it and studied it for a long moment before I looked at what came after it. The stride pattern leading away from that print was extended far beyond what a normal walking gait produces, not by a step or two of variation, by a consistent, repeating distance that told a clear story to anyone who had spent enough time reading ground sign in pursuit situations. Gerald had been running from that point, running hard the way a person runs when something behind them has removed every other option from consideration. I radioed it in, marked the GPS coordinates, photographed the print from multiple angles, and kept moving northeast. Davis and I didn't say much about it. We noted it and moved. That is how you work a search. You note things and you keep moving and you let the picture assemble itself as you go. But I felt the weight of it, and I could see from the set of Davis's jaw that he felt it too. The radio call came in from Team 3 at approximately 4:15 in the afternoon. Subject located. Ravine drainage below the Finger outcropping, approximately 2 miles northeast of Gerald's planned route. Alive. Requesting medical support and extraction coordinates. Davis and I were the closest secondary team, and we moved fast, coming down a steep switchback through a dense stand of hemlocks that blocked what little afternoon light remained. The temperature had already dropped several degrees since noon, and the shadows between the trees were thickening into something more solid. I heard Gerald before I saw him. A low, irregular sound that I initially took for an injured animal, the kind of involuntary vocalization that hypothermia produces when the body is working very hard just to maintain basic function. He was at the bottom of the ravine in a natural depression where two drainage channels converged, partially sheltered beneath a fallen red oak that had come down sometime in the past year. The bark was still on it, the root ball still holding a wall of soil and rock on the uphill side. It was the kind of spot an experienced hiker might choose deliberately if they needed to conserve body heat and wait out a night. The fact that Gerald had found it told me that even in whatever state he had been in, some part of his training and experience had still been working. Our medic reached him seconds after I did and began her assessment with the focused efficiency that serious field medicine requires. His core temperature was critically low. He had a complex fracture of the right forearm consistent with a hard fall onto an outstretched hand, 2 fractured ribs on the left side with associated bruising that suggested significant blunt force impact, and lacerations across his upper back and left shoulder that I watched our medic examine and then examine again without speaking. She worked quietly and professionally and did not editorialize, but at one point, while she was irrigating the shoulder wound in preparation for field dressing, she said 4 words to me in a voice low enough that only I could hear them. "These are not falls." She did not repeat it, and I did not ask her to. He was conscious, not fully, not reliably, but present enough to register our voices and to respond to touch. When I knelt beside him and took his hand and told him we had him and that he was going to be all right, his fingers tightened around mine with more strength than I expected from someone in his condition. He couldn't form words. His lips were moving and his jaw was working, and sounds were coming out, but nothing that resolved into language. I stayed close, kept talking, kept his attention on my face. At some point in the 20 minutes before the helicopter arrived, Gerald turned his head and looked directly at me with a clarity that had not been there before, the way people sometimes surface briefly in serious medical distress before receding again. He couldn't speak, but the sound he produced was unmistakably an attempt at communication, an urgent and specific attempt, and his eyes moved in a direction that was not random. He looked at the ridge above the ravine, the tree line up there, 30 or 40 yards above us on the slope. He looked at it, and then back at me, and there was something in his face in that moment that I have not been able to set down since. It was not the generalized fear of a man in pain and shock. It was specific. It was directed. Whatever Gerald Pryor was afraid of was still up there on that ridge, and some part of him that had not yet accepted that he was safe needed me to know that. He was extracted by helicopter at dusk and airlifted to the trauma center in Asheville. I watched the aircraft rise above the tree line and bank south and disappear, and then I stood in the growing dark at the bottom of that ravine and began to look at the ground the way I had been trained to look at ground for 18 years. The soil in that ravine holds impressions exceptionally well. 2 drainage channels converging means constant moisture, constant softness, a surface that registers weight and movement with something close to precision. Gerald's boot pattern was everywhere, going in multiple directions, overlapping itself, the scattered evidence of a man who had been moving in confused circles, who had fallen repeatedly, who had been in that ravine for many hours before we found him. I mapped his movements methodically, working from the outside in, building the picture the way you build any picture in this work. And then I found the other impressions, and the picture changed into something I did not have a framework for. They were not boot prints. I want to be as precise as I can about this because I have gone back over it in my mind more times than I can count, and I have not been able to produce an alternative explanation that holds. I know black bear tracks in soft Carolina mountain soil the way I know my own handwriting. I know the pad structure, the claw registration, the way the weight distributes across the track in different gaits. These were not bear tracks. The shape was wrong in ways that were not subtle. The forward portion of each impression was wider and more articulated than any bear track, with individual toe placements that registered separately from one another with a depth and spacing that suggested not just weight but intention, deliberate placement, careful movement. The tracks moved around the perimeter of the area where Gerald had been sheltering in a pattern that I stood over for a long time in the beam of my flashlight, trying to find the innocent explanation, trying to find the animal behavior that would account for what I was seeing. The stride length was what finally made me step back and just stand still for a moment in the cold. Between each set of impressions, the distance was far beyond what the width of the track suggested was possible. Whatever left those marks was very tall. It had been moving around the edges of that ravine slowly, at a pace that had nothing urgent or reactive about it. It had been circling, and some of the impressions, the ones closest to where Gerald had been lying, were pressed deeper than the others, the way a track deepens when the animal making it has stopped and shifted its weight forward, the way something presses into the ground when it is standing still and looking at something for a long time. I did not include everything I found that evening in my radio report back to staging. I documented it, photographed it, marked the GPS coordinates of every significant impression I could identify in the failing light. But I kept my descriptions on the radio general and procedural, because I had learned enough in 18 years of working with law enforcement and Park Service personnel to know that the moment you say something that doesn't fit the expected narrative on an open channel, the conversation changes in ways that are not useful to anyone. So I said I had found evidence of large animal activity in the immediate area of the subject's location and that I was documenting it for the investigative team. That was true. It was just not complete. The investigative team arrived the following morning. 2 rangers from the Forest Service and a wildlife biologist from the state agency who had been called in to assess the animal attack angle, which was already the working theory before anyone had looked at the ground. I met them at the trailhead and walked them in. The biologist was a competent and serious woman named Carver, who had done predator work in the southern Appalachians for many years, and who I had worked with briefly on a previous incident involving a bear attack on a campsite near the Black Mountain area. I respected her professionally, and I watched her face carefully when we reached the ravine and she began her examination. She worked the way good field scientists work, slowly and without premature conclusions, crouching over each impression, measuring, photographing, taking notes in a small, weatherproof notebook she kept in her breast pocket. She spent a long time on the deepest impressions near Gerald's shelter site. She measured the stride distances twice. I watched her do the arithmetic in her head, and I watched something shift slightly in her expression, not dramatically, not in a way that anyone who didn't know her face would have noticed. Just a tightening. a reassessment happening behind her eyes that she was choosing not to voice out loud. She stood up and looked at the slope above the ravine for a moment without speaking. Then she turned and continued her documentation as though nothing unusual had occurred. Later, when the rangers were occupied at the other end of the ravine, she came and stood next to me and looked at the ground between us and said quietly that the track measurements were outside the range of any bear population currently documented in western North Carolina. She said it the way a person states a fact that they have not yet decided what to do with. Then she closed her notebook and walked back toward the rangers, and that was the last time she addressed the subject directly with me. The official report, which I obtained a copy of through a records request several months later, attributed Gerald's injuries to a fall on steep terrain followed by a secondary encounter with a black bear, which was said to have investigated him while he was incapacitated and produced the lacerations on his back and shoulder through defensive swatting behavior. The tracks were described as consistent with a large male black bear. The stride anomalies were not mentioned. The depth and pattern of the impressions near the shelter site were not mentioned. The report was 4 pages long, and it was written with the kind of careful, measured language that tells you more in what it omits than in what it includes. I went back to the ravine 3 days after the official investigation closed. I went alone, early in the morning, before the light was fully established, because I had been thinking about something since the night we found Gerald, and I needed to look at it without anyone else present. I had been thinking about the tree line above the ravine, the ridge where Gerald had directed his eyes in that moment of clarity before the helicopter arrived. I had not been up there yet. The official team had not gone up there either, as far as I could determine from the report. The climb from the ravine floor to the ridge took about 15 minutes on ground that was steep and loose in places, scattered with the same wet leaves that covered every slope in the Pisgah in late October. I came up through a gap in the laurel and stood on a shelf of exposed rock that jutted out slightly over the ravine below, and from that position, I could see everything. The fallen oak where Gerald had sheltered, the drainage channels and the soft ground around them. The whole floor of the ravine laid out below me in the gray morning light, clear and complete, a perfect vantage point for watching something on the ground below without being visible from below in return. The rock shelf was maybe 8 feet across and 4 feet deep, sheltered on the uphill side by a dense wall of mountain laurel that would have made it nearly invisible from any approach except the one I had taken. And on the surface of that rock, and in the soft soil at its edges where the shelf met the slope, there were marks that I spent the better part of an hour documenting before I allowed myself to think about what they meant. The rock itself showed scraping that I cannot attribute to weather or geological process. Long parallel grooves in the surface at the forward edge of the shelf, the edge that faced the ravine, spaced and angled in a way that was consistent with the weight of something very large, settling forward onto that edge and gripping it. The kind of marks that come from sustained pressure, applied repeatedly over some period of time, not a single pass, but a prolonged stay. Whatever had been on that shelf had been there long enough to leave those marks through repeated contact with the stone. In the soil at the sides of the shelf, I found the clearest impressions I had seen in the entire area. The ground there was sheltered from direct rain by the laurel canopy overhead and had retained moisture and softness in a way the ravine floor had not. I measured the impressions carefully with a tape measure I had brought specifically for this purpose. The length of the clearest print was 17 inches from heel to toe. The width across the forward portion was 9 inches. The depth in the center of the track was just over an inch, which on soil of that consistency indicated substantial weight. The toe impressions were distinct and individually separated, 5 of them, registering with a spread in depth that I have no category for in any track identification guide I have ever used. I sat on the slope above that shelf for a long time after I finished my documentation, long enough that the morning light shifted and the ravens that worked that part of the ridge began moving through the canopy above me in their slow, deliberate circles. I was thinking about Gerald on the ravine floor below, about the hours he had spent down there in the dark and the cold before we found him, about whether he had known something was above him on that ridge watching him, about whether the knowledge of that was part of what I had seen in his eyes when he looked past my face at the tree line. I visited Gerald twice during his recovery. The first time was about 3 weeks after the rescue at a rehabilitation facility in Asheville, where he was being treated for the rib injuries and working with a physical therapist on his arm. He was doing better physically, sitting up, eating well, color back in his face. But he did not want to talk about what had happened, and I did not push him. We talked about his daughter and about the weather and about nothing in particular. And when I left, I told him I was glad he was going to be all right, and I meant it. The second visit was about 4 months later, after he had gone home to his house outside of Brevard. He called me, which surprised me. He said he had been thinking about some things and he wanted to talk. I drove out on a Thursday afternoon in late February, sat at his kitchen table while he made coffee, and listened for almost 2 hours while Gerald Pryor told me what had happened to him in those mountains. He had been on the trail early on the second day, moving northeast toward a viewpoint he had visited several times before. The morning was cold and clear, good visibility, no weather concerns. He was maybe 3 miles into the day's planned route when he noticed the birds had gone quiet. Not gradually, the way bird noise fades when you move through different terrain, all at once, as if something had switched them off. He had noticed this kind of silence before, in those woods, and he knew what it generally meant, that something larger than the birds was moving nearby, and they had decided to stop advertising their presence. He slowed down, became more deliberate in his movement, started paying attention to the spaces between the trees in a way he hadn't been before. He smelled it before he heard it or saw it. He described the smell carefully because it had stayed with him with the vividness that sensory memories attached to fear retain for a very long time. It was animal in the way that a bear is animal, that thick, heavy biological presence that large mammals carry with them. But there was something else underneath it, something sharper and more complex. Something he said reminded him of the smell of a predator's enclosure at a zoo, that particular combination of musk and meat, and something almost chemical that tells the older parts of your brain to pay attention. He smelled it and stopped walking completely and stood still on the trail and listened. The sound came from his right, off the trail in the timber, maybe 60 or 70 feet away. Not a crashing or a sudden movement, a slow, deliberate sound. The sound of something large moving through dry leaves at a walking pace, placing each step with a care that the sound itself made strange. Large animals moving through dry leaf litter are not typically careful. They do not typically edit their own noise. This sound was edited, controlled. The spacing between footfalls was longer than a bear's walking pace, and the rhythm was different, a 2-beat pattern rather than the 4-beat shuffle of a quadruped moving at a walk. Gerald stood on the trail and listened to that sound move parallel to him through the timber for what he estimated was about 2 minutes. Then it stopped. The silence that followed was complete in a way he said he had never experienced in the Pisgah in 20 years of hiking its trails. Not just the absence of the movement sound, the absence of everything, no wind in the upper canopy, no small animals in the leaf litter, no distant bird calls from the ridgeline above. A silence with weight and texture and direction pressing toward him from the right side of the trail where the sound had stopped. He made the decision that he later told me he should have made the moment the birds went quiet, which was to turn around and move back toward the trailhead at the best pace he could manage. He did not run because his experience told him that running was the wrong response to an unknown large animal in close proximity. He walked fast, kept his steps deliberate and even, kept his eyes forward and his breathing controlled. He had gone maybe a quarter mile back down the trail when he became certain he was being followed. He could not point to a single specific sound or movement that told him this. It was cumulative. The way the silence moved with him rather than staying behind. The way the air on the right side of the trail felt different from the air on the left side. The awareness of mass and attention that prey animals carry in their nervous systems and that humans retain in a diluted form that most of us have learned to talk ourselves out of recognizing. Gerald did not talk himself out of it. He trusted it. And then he made a mistake that he has forgiven himself for because it was the mistake any experienced hiker in a state of controlled fear would make. He left the trail. He thought he could cut cross-country to a Forest Service road that he knew ran roughly parallel to the trail about a mile to the east. He had done it before on familiar ground. But he was moving fast, and the terrain in that section was more broken than he had remembered, and the light was starting to drop toward afternoon gray. And somewhere in the first 30 minutes of that cross-country push, he lost his precise orientation and began to make the small compounding errors that serious backcountry situations are built from. He moved downhill when he should have contoured. He crossed a drainage running the wrong direction and didn't catch it until he had followed it too far. By the time the light was fully gone, he was in the ravine below the finger, and his right arm was fractured from a fall on a wet rock face, and 2 of his ribs were in pieces from a second fall into a boulder-filled drainage channel. He found the shelter under the fallen oak by feel more than sight, and he got himself into it and managed to activate the emergency whistle on his pack, and then he waited. He told me that he did not hear or smell or sense anything unusual during the first part of that night, that the pain and the cold occupied most of his awareness, and that he drifted in and out of something that was not quite sleep and not quite consciousness. But sometime in the deep middle of the night, in the hours between midnight and the first gray suggestion of dawn, he came fully awake with a clarity that he said felt like cold water poured directly into his brain. He lay still under the oak and listened. There was something above him on the slope. He could not hear it moving. He could not smell it the way he had smelled it on the trail. But he knew it was there the way he said, "You know when someone has come into a dark room while you were sleeping, that displacement of air and attention and presence that the body registers before the conscious mind catches up." He lay still for a very long time. He did not move. He did not use his whistle again. He told me that some instinct he could not name and did not question told him clearly that making noise was exactly the wrong thing to do. He said nothing came down into the ravine. Nothing approached his shelter. But the presence above him on the slope did not go away either, not for what felt like hours, not until the sky began to lighten in the east, and the birds in the timber above the ridge started their first tentative sounds of early morning. And then, in the space between one moment and the next, the feeling of being watched simply stopped, as completely and decisively as it had begun. Gerald finished his coffee and looked out his kitchen window at the tree line at the back of his property for a long moment before he said the last thing he said to me that afternoon. He said he had been in those mountains for 20 years, and he had respected them properly the whole time, and he was not afraid of them. But he was not going back to the Pisgah. He said it quietly and without drama, the way a person states a decision that has already been fully made and does not require further discussion. He has not gone back. I know this because his daughter is a volunteer on our team now, and she has told me that her father spends his time on his 12 acres and does not go into the forest anymore, not even the familiar second-growth timber at the back edge of his own property. I still work search and rescue. I still go into those mountains regularly, sometimes for operations, and sometimes just because the work requires familiarity with the terrain, and you maintain that familiarity by being present in it. But I have changed the way I move through certain sections of the Pisgah, particularly in the northeastern quadrants where the terrain gets broken and remote and the tree canopy closes overhead, and the silence has that particular quality that I have learned to take seriously. I pay more attention to the spaces between the trees than I used to. I check ridgelines above me when I'm working drainage areas. I notice when the birds stop. I don't know what was on that shelf above the ravine, watching Gerald Pryor through the night. I don't know what made those impressions in the soft soil, what produced the stride lengths I measured, what left those marks in the surface of the stone at the forward edge of the shelf. I have my documentation, my photographs, my measurements, all of it stored carefully in a place where it will not be lost. I don't know what I will ever do with it. What I know is that Gerald was an experienced and careful man who went into familiar terrain and encountered something that changed him in a way that 20 years of solo hiking in difficult mountains had never come close to doing. What I know is that our medic said 4 words under her breath over his wounds that she did not repeat and did not put in her report. What I know is that a wildlife biologist with decades of predator experience in those specific mountains looked at a set of tracks and went quiet in a way that said more than anything she chose to say out loud. The Pisgah is 750,000 acres of mountain forest. Most of it is beautiful, and most of it is safe, and most of the people who walk into it come back out unchanged. I believe that, and I want to be clear that I believe it. But there are sections of those mountains that I have come to understand differently than I understood them before October of 2019. Sections where the silence has weight and direction. Sections where the ridge above you deserves more attention than the trail in front of you. Sections where the thing you cannot hear may be paying considerably more attention to you than you are paying to it. If you spend time in places like that, I think it is worth knowing that the map of what lives there may not be as complete as we have been led to believe. I think it is worth paying attention. And I think that if the birds stop, you should trust that they stopped for a reason.